A black bear refuses to leave the old woman at night. Her son's reaction is shocking. The wind stirred gently through the dense pine forest, carrying with it the scent of snow and silence. High in the Colorado wilderness, where the mountains kissed the sky and the only clock was the sun tracing across the horizon, Elena Brooks moved like part of the landscape itself. Her cabin, weather-worn but sturdy, stood tucked beneath a bluff overlooking a stream that wound its way through the trees like a silver ribbon. It was the kind of place people visited to disappear, and for Elena, that was precisely the point. 6 months had passed since Henry died. 6 months since the world she knew narrowed to one long ache, wrapped in frost and quiet. She was not a woman unaccustomed to solitude. She had spent decades tracking wolves through dense underbrush, recording bird migration patterns, and studying elk herd behavior. But this silence was different. This was not solitude, it was absence. Each morning she rose before the sun, boiled water for tea, and stepped outside with the discipline that had once made her a respected ecologist. She checked her trail cameras, fed the juncos and chickadees who now depended on her presence, and walked the same worn path to the stream. Henry used to walk it with her, his laugh echoing softly between the trees. Now there was only the crunch of her boots on frost-hardened earth and the whistle of wind through bare branches. It was on one of these mornings mid-October, with the sky smeared in cold lavender light, that she saw him. At first she thought it was a trick of the shadows, a fallen log perhaps, or a blackened boulder catching the sunrise wrong. But as she stepped closer, she felt a pang in her gut, the same instinct that had once saved her from walking into a cougar's den. The shape near the water was not stone, it was alive. Barely. A black bear cub, no more than a few months old, lay crumpled near the stream's edge, his fur wet and clumped with burrs and dirt. His limbs were tucked in, ribs showing through matted fur, his breathing shallow and labored. Elena stopped 10 yards away, crouching low. She knew better than to approach too closely. Cubs were rarely alone, and a protective sow was the last thing she wanted to encounter unprepared. But the forest around her was quiet, too quiet. No prints, no signs of recent disturbance, no scent on the wind. The cub was alone, her heart clenched. Elena stood slowly and backed away, her thoughts racing. He wouldn't last the night. Not like this, not with temperatures dropping below freezing. She returned to the cabin with her pulse tight in her throat, every step home echoing louder than the one before. The cub haunted her thoughts all day. She tried to distract herself, chopping wood, sketching notes in the margin of an old field journal, even tuning her weather radio just to hear a voice. But as twilight deepened and shadows lengthened across the snow-dusted trail, she knew she would go back. Just before dusk, she packed a small bowl of oats soaked in honey, a tin of canned salmon, and a thermos of warm water. She left the food near the stream, hidden beneath a cluster of young aspens, then slipped quietly behind a fallen log and waited. The forest settled around her like an old quilt. Minutes stretched into an hour. At first, nothing stirred. Then a rustle. The cub, still weak, still trembling, sniffed the air. He dragged himself forward with painful slowness, his claws scraping the frozen ground. He paused, lifted his nose, and caught the scent. Elena held her breath. He reached the food with hesitant steps, nudging it, then devoured it with desperate gulps, pausing only to breathe. She watched, transfixed. When he finished, he curled into himself again and slept. Right there by the rocks, his sides rising a bit fuller than before. She felt something in her chest crack, an ancient, grief-worn place, raw and tender. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, nursing tea gone cold, her eyes fixed on the window, as if expecting to see him again. The next morning, he was gone. The food was liquidy clean, the moss disturbed. Prince, tiny, uncertain, led back into the trees. Relief and disappointment warred inside her. She didn't want him to vanish, but she didn't want him dependent either. She understood the rules. Wild was wild. It had to be. Still, the next morning, she brought more food, and the morning after. And so it began. A rhythm formed, a silent agreement. She would bring offerings and leave. He would wait and eat and disappear. A dance of distance. She named him Willow. It suited him, small and resilient, the color of river stones and wet bark. The name also belonged to the bent tree by the stream, the one that had survived a lightning strike and still grew, its trunk twisted but proud. Like him, like her. Days passed, then weeks. Willow grew stronger. He walked with more confidence. His fur began to shine again beneath the frost, and his ribs faded beneath layers of new muscle. Yet he never crossed the invisible boundary that separated Elena's world from his. He never stepped past the edge of the trees. Not once. She began speaking to him. Not loud, never a summons, but soft were barely whispers, musings, memories. The way she had once spoken to Henry on quiet walks. You know, she murmured one morning as she placed the salmon on a flat stone. He used to say the trees here breathe better than we do. She smiled faintly. I didn't understand that until he died. Willow watched her from the rise, eyes dark and unreadable. Then he turned, lumbered into the pines, and was gone again. That night she dreamed of Henry standing at the tree line, his silhouette rimmed in golden light, his hand outstretched not toward her, but toward a shadow just beside him. A shape with bright, wild eyes. A bear. She awoke before dawn, her chest tight but not with sadness. With something else. With presence. Caleb called every Sunday, and she answered. He asked the same questions. Was she warm enough? Had she considered a visit to town? Did she want him to come for Thanksgiving? She gave the same answers. I'm fine, the stove's working. And no, not this year. But this last time something shifted in his voice. A note of worry edged in, more persistent than before. I've been looking into some support for the winter, Mom. Someone who can help. You're out there all alone. She resisted. He pushed. In the end, she agreed, not because she needed help, but because she was tired of fighting. Maybe it would be a short visit, a check-in. No more than a few days. That morning, she told Willow, you'll be seeing someone new around here soon. Don't worry, I'll keep our secret. She paused. I don't want things to change either. The wind picked up. The air carried the bite of snow not yet fallen. And from the trees just beyond her sight, she knew he was still there, watching, just as she was. In that wild quiet, Elena realized something had taken root. Not joy, not quite healing, but purpose. And sometimes that was enough to keep living. The first snowfall came early that year. Thick, wet flakes drifted from the sky in slow spirals, coating the cabin roof and tree branches in a blanket of white. Elena stood at the window with her tea, watching as the forest transformed into a cathedral of silence. Every sound seemed to soften beneath the snow's hush, except the sharp bark of her kettle boiling too long and the creak of the cabin's bones adjusting to the sudden cold. She had already made the morning walk, boots crunching through frost, breath clouding before her face, to leave Willow his food. And true to his nature, he had waited just out of reach. Bigger now, fur gleaming black against the dull browns and grays of winter's approach, he had watched her with those steady, unreadable eyes. When she turned to go, she heard the rustle of him moving toward the food, and she smiled without meaning to. It had become such a constant rhythm that the forest no longer felt empty. She no longer felt adrift in it. That afternoon, the knock came. Elena jumped. She wasn't used to unexpected visitors. For a moment, she simply stared at the door, as if it were an animal she couldn't yet identify. Then she moved to open it. There stood a woman, mid-30s, wrapped in a navy parka, dusted with snow. She had an olive complexion, sleek dark hair pulled back into a low braid, and eyes that flicked around the cabin with quiet calculation. Vivian Hale, she said, holding out a gloved hand. Caleb arranged for me to come by. Said you could use some support for the winter? Her voice was pleasant enough, but something about her smile felt prepared, practiced. Elena hesitated a second too long before shaking her hand. Yes, she said slowly. He mentioned you. Vivian stepped inside, glancing around. It's beautiful out here, she remarked. Quiet, peaceful. It is, Elena replied, closing the door behind her. The snow clung to Vivian's boots as she crossed to the hearth. She didn't ask permission before kneeling to warm her hands by the fire. Elena watched her with a stillness honed from years of fieldwork, learning to see not just what moved, but what was absent. Something about the way Vivian moved through the cabin felt invasive, like someone assessing the value of each object in the room rather than appreciating its use or memory. Over the next few days, Vivian settled in. She was efficient, cheerful when necessary, and unnervingly silent when not. She cooked well, tidied without being asked, and kept track of medications, which Elena found both helpful and unnerving. It wasn't that Vivian was unkind, it was that she was too prepared. Elena had seen her type before in the world of research. People who wore competence like a mask, whose curiosity was rarely innocent. Still, she said nothing. She didn't want to seem ungrateful, especially to Caleb, who had only meant to help. But as days passed, small things began to gnaw at her. She noticed her pill organizer rearranged in ways she hadn't left it. Her legal folders, which she kept tucked in the cedar trunk near her bed, had been shifted. Vivian never mentioned the trail cameras Elena used to monitor wildlife. But one day Elena found the SD card from the south-facing camera was missing. She didn't confront her. Not yet. But that night, Elena sat by the fire, stroking the grain of the wooden armrest Henry had carved years ago, and felt a prickle at the back of her neck. She'd been in the wild long enough to know when she was being watched, not by creatures who belonged to the land, but by something else. Something that had learned how to hide in plain sight. Willow hadn't come the last 2 mornings. At first, she'd told herself it was the snow, the shift in weather, the natural rhythm of a young bear preparing for hibernation. But today, as she stood at the edge of the clearing with the food untouched and the woods too still, a sense of unease settled in her bones. She scanned the trees, nothing. Yet she felt it, felt him, watching, pacing, agitated. That evening, Vivian returned from a trip into town earlier than expected. Elena noticed faint scratches on the doorframe that hadn't been there before. She also noticed the way Willow's prints circled the cabin, then veered off into the trees like something had driven him away. That night, she retrieved the SD card from the North Trail camera, the one Vivian hadn't touched. She plugged it into her laptop, heart pounding, her fingers trembling slightly as the images loaded. At first, it was the usual, deer crossing at twilight, foxes weaving through the brush. Then she saw it, a figure moving beneath the cover of dusk. Vivian, emerging from the cabin, stepping lightly toward the edge of the woods, holding something in her hand. Elena paused the footage, leaned closer. Pills, her pills. Vivian tossed something into the brush, then returned to the cabin, her posture smooth, almost rehearsed. Later, another frame caught her crouched near the cedar trunk, slipping a folder into her coat. Elena leaned back in her chair, nausea rising in her throat. The betrayal wasn't sharp, it was dull, quiet, heavy, like wet snow, the kind that broke branches. The next morning, Elena didn't tell Vivian what she knew. Instead, she called Caleb. Her voice was calm, steady, colder than the snow-covered trees outside. "I need you to come," she said. "Now." Caleb's concern sharpened. "What's wrong?" "I'll explain when you get here." She didn't give him time to argue. That afternoon, she packed a bag, not for herself, but for evidence. The footage, the altered medication, the documents, and she waited. Vivian noticed the shift. "You seem off today," she said casually. "Everything all right?" Elena gave her a tight smile. "Just feeling the cold in my bones." When Caleb arrived, he brought with him the local deputy. Elena handed over everything. No tears, no dramatic accusations. Just the truth, laid bare like a trail in fresh snow. Vivian's expression faltered as they escorted her out, her mask slipping just enough for Elena to see the sharp glint beneath. Deception had never needed a snarl. Sometimes it wore warmth like armor. That night, Elena returned to the clearing. The food had been disturbed, not devoured, just nudged, shifted, touched. She stood there for a long while, waiting. Then she saw him. Willow. At the edge of the trees, chest broader now, coat thick and dark with winter's edge. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. Their eyes met, and in that moment, everything unsaid between them passed like wind through the branches. She placed her hand to her chest and whispered, "Thank you." He stood a moment longer, then vanished into the trees. The snow kept falling. But inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily, and Elena sat with her journal, a hot cup of tea, and a sense of peace she hadn't felt in many seasons. She knew the wilderness still held danger. That time would pass and bring with it more change, more grief, more beauty. But for now, she was held, not by walls, not by safety, but by something older. wiser. The quiet covenant between a woman who had lost everything and a bear who had come unbidden to fill the empty spaces was something close to grace. The days that followed Vivian's arrest unfolded like snowmelt in spring, slow, silent, inevitable. Caleb stayed for a few nights, bustling around the cabin with the protective urgency of a son who hadn't realized until now just how vulnerable his mother could be. He repaired the front step, tightened the stove's hinges, and offered to install new locks, new alarms, anything that might restore a sense of security. But Elena declined gently. The cabin wasn't meant to be sealed from the world. Its walls had always breathed, letting in the cold and the wild and the risk. She would not shut it now. What she had lost to Vivian was not safety. It was trust. And what she had gained in its place was something far older and more enduring. She didn't tell Caleb about Willow. Not really. She spoke of bears in passing, as she always had, mentioning changes in the tracks, the shifting patterns of behavior. He wouldn't understand the rest. It wasn't something that lived easily in words anyway. What could she say? That a young bear had stood in the gap between her and danger, alerting her in ways no human could? That he had become a presence in her life more vital than the echo of her grief? So instead, she let the secret remain in the trees, unspoken. The snow deepened as November rolled in. The forest grew quieter, its creatures preparing for the long hush of winter. And yet each morning Elena still followed her routine. She brought offerings, nuts, dried berries, smoked trout, placing them on the same flat stone beside the willow tree. Some days the food remained untouched, and she would return home with it heavy in her pack, knowing he hadn't come. But other days she would find paw prints, soft and round, leading to the offering and away again, as if Willow had stepped briefly into her world and then vanished like a dream at dawn. She started writing again. Not the sterile field notes of her earlier career, but something more raw, more instinctive. She filled the pages of her old journal with sketches of bear tracks, pine trees bent under snow, the curve of Willow's back as he moved through the shadows. She wrote letters to Henry, as she used to in the months after he passed, telling him about the forest, the firewood, the stars. But now, more and more, she found herself telling him about the bear. "He waits," she wrote one evening, the fire crackling low beside her. "He never crosses into the yard. I think he knows the line that separates what we are from what we are not. But sometimes I wish he wouldn't be so polite. Sometimes I want to call out and say, 'You're not alone either.'" One night a sharp wind rattled the shutters. The air turned brittle with frost, and the firewood stack was already low. Elena bundled herself in Henry's old coat and ventured out early, just before sunrise. The world was blue and still, the kind of stillness that makes your breath seem too loud. She reached the clearing and saw them, 3 sets of prints this time. Not one. 3. She blinked, thinking at first it was the wind playing tricks on the snow. But no, they were real. Smaller tracks flanked the larger ones, weaving and tumbling in a chaotic, playful path. Elena stood frozen, hand tightening around her thermos. Cubs. He had cubs. Her throat tightened with something that might have been true or something deeper. Reverence, maybe. She followed the trail a few steps, careful not to disturb it, and found that he had led them right to the stone. The food was gone, every bite, and around the stone were signs of rolling, pawing, tumbling chaos, marks of young life discovering the world. She smiled then, wide and true. He had brought them here. He had trusted her space. She didn't see him that day or the next, but it didn't matter. She moved through the cabin as if wrapped in a secret blessing. Everything shimmered with meaning. The crackle of the fire, the shape of frost on the window, the scent of pine smoke curling into the rafters. She wrote again in her journal. He came back, and he wasn't alone. I don't know what it means yet, but something in me feels steadier. Like the wind has shifted direction. Caleb called again, his voice tired from work, distracted by deadlines. He asked if she was sure she was all right, if she needed anything. She assured him she was fine. Better than fine. She didn't tell him about the cubs, not because she wanted to keep it from him, but because it wasn't hers to explain. It was the forest's story now, and she was simply lucky enough to witness a chapter of it. Weeks passed. The snow piled high against the cabin walls, muting the world. Yet inside the hearth glowed warm, and Elena's spirit grew strong. She began carving again, just as she and Henry once had during long winters. Small wooden creatures whittled with patience and care. She started with birds, then foxes, and then, inevitably, a bear. She shaped its rounded shoulders, the curve of its snout, the gentle tilt of its head. Then two smaller figures beside it, one paw raised in mid-step. It was not perfect, but it held truth. It held memory. She placed it near the trailhead, atop a smooth stone where the sun would catch it each morning. Beneath it, she carved a simple plaque. She watched, she warned, she saved. And though no one else might know the full meaning, Elena did. And somewhere in the trees, she believed Willow might too. That night, the sky cleared, the stars stretched wide across the heavens, and the cold carried a purity that made her lungs ache. She stepped outside one last time before bed, drawn by instinct more than reason. The trees stood silent, dark, sentinel-like. And then she saw them. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the cabin light, three shapes stood still. Willow in the middle, his massive form unmistakable, flanked by two cubs. They did not move. They only watched. Elena raised a hand slowly, not waving, just acknowledging. Her chest swelled with something she hadn't felt since Henry's last breath. Not closure, not healing, but belonging. Willow blinked slowly, his body casting a long shadow in the snow. Then, without sound, he turned and led his cubs back into the forest. The quiet returned, the cold deepened, but inside the cabin, the fire burned steady, and Elena sat near the window, her heart full of the kind of peace only the wild could give. Not a peace born of safety, but of understanding, that we are never truly alone when we learn to listen. Not just with our ears, but with everything we are. She touched the edge of the journal and wrote one final line for the night. Some guardians do not knock. They wait in the trees, silent and patient, until we are ready to hear them. December crept in without fanfare, wrapping the forest in a quiet so complete, it seemed the trees themselves held their breath. Elena marked the days only by the length of the shadows and the deepening cold in her bones. The snow now lay waist-deep along the northern slope, and icicles curled like claws from the eaves of her cabin. Inside, the fire glowed endlessly, logs burning with soft snaps and hisses, while outside the world remained draped in stillness. But something in her had changed. The silence no longer pressed down on her like weight. It had become a companion, a language, one she had learned from watching the woods, and from the black bear who had emerged from it like a question, and left behind an answer she was still unwrapping each morning. She hadn't seen Willow again since the night he brought the cubs. It had been nearly 2 weeks now, maybe more, though time had taken on a strange, elastic rhythm. She didn't worry, not exactly. She knew the patterns of hibernation, knew how the wild retreated into sleep as the world froze. But she found herself listening for him anyway, watching the tree line each morning, her breath fogging the window as she scanned the woods for some shadow, some movement, some quiet breath of fur and muscle passing through snow. One morning, just after the solstice, a soft knock startled her out of her chair. Not a human knock, she knew the difference, but a faint thud at the far end of the cabin, near the back shed. Her heart lifted without permission. She wrapped herself in Henry's coat and stepped out into the snow. The air bit hard, wind sharp against her cheeks, but she didn't care. She rounded the cabin and stopped cold. Tracks, not just willows. These were larger now, deeper. The cubs were growing. She crouched beside the nearest set, gloved fingers brushing the edge of the print. The snow was fresh, less than an hour old. Her eyes lifted toward the woods, scanning the underbrush, the narrow game trails threading between the pines. Nothing moved, but she felt it again, that certainty blooming in her chest like firelight. He was close. They were. Inside, she poured hot water into her mug, her hands trembling slightly, not from cold, but from a strange, swelling gladness she hadn't known in years. She drank slowly, then pulled her coat off and moved to the old cedar trunk near the window. Inside were Henry's carving tools, still neatly wrapped in the oilcloth he used to keep them from rusting. She hadn't opened them since the funeral. Her fingers hesitated on the latch, then undid it. The tools were exactly as he'd left them, smooth-handled, worn at the edges, each one carrying the ghost of his grip. She held the smallest blade, a whittling knife, and felt tears rise behind her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the quiet rightness of this moment. She carried the tools to her work table, took a fresh block of pine from the stack, and began to carve. She didn't need a plan. Her hands knew what to do. Each curve of the knife brought back memory of Henry sitting beside her, of their laughter echoing through the cabin, of wood shavings falling like curled petals to the floor. She worked slowly, letting the bear emerge from the wood as if it had always been there, waiting. This one she carved alone, not with cubs, not standing tall, but sitting, head tilted slightly, eyes lifted, not at the viewer, but at something distant, something unseen, a silent guardian. That afternoon she hiked to the trailhead, snowshoes strapped to her boots, the carved bear tucked safely in her pack. She followed the path she and Henry had once walked every autumn, when the aspens turned gold and the air smelled of moss and campfire smoke. She found the smooth stone she'd chosen weeks ago, cleared it of snow, and placed the new carving beside the others. She stepped back. A fox statue, a carved eagle, a rabbit, small and proud. And now Willow. Her hand hovered over the bear's wooden shoulder, and she whispered aloud, "Thank you." It wasn't just for the warning, not even just for the rescue. It was for the watching, the presence, for reminding her that the forest was not empty, even when it seemed silent, for giving her a reason to step outside each morning when grief had once kept her curled beneath blankets, numb and unmoving. She stood a long time in the cold until her toes tingled and her breath came in sharp clouds. Then she turned and made her way home, the trees sighing softly in the wind. The next few days passed without new tracks. She told herself it made sense. The cold had deepened, the snow piled high, and the bears would have found their dens by now. But she still left food once a week, smoked fish, oats, dried blueberries, just in case. She did not expect anything in return. The gift was not in seeing him, but in having seen him at all. And then, one morning, in early January, a shift, a feeling, a pulse in the woods. She stepped outside before sunrise, the sky a pale lavender, stars fading from view. At the edge of the clearing, near the willow tree, she saw something strange. A shape. It was not Willow, not a bear at all. It was a person, a child maybe. No, a woman. Standing still, wrapped in a red parka, facing the trees. Elena's breath caught. Her instinct flared hot. Too many memories of Vivian, of danger hidden behind politeness. She stepped forward cautiously. "Hello," she called. The figure turned, a young woman, her face pale, eyes wide. "I saw the carvings," she said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude, She paused. "I used to hike here with my grandfather, before he died. I remembered this place. The bear was new. Her voice cracked. It felt like something I needed to see. Elena relaxed slowly, her heartbeat easing. "You're welcome here," she said gently. "It's a good trail." The woman nodded, then glanced at the forest behind her. "Do you really think they watch us?" she asked. Elena followed her gaze. "Yes," she said, "I do." The woman smiled then, a small flicker of peace passing across her face, and after a moment she turned and walked back the way she came, her boots crunching softly through the snow. Elena stood still for a long while, the quiet of the forest wrapping around her like a blanket. She understood something now, something she hadn't before. Willow's gift had never been just the warning. It had been the reminder that the wild does not forget us, that even in the deepest grief, something will come. Watch, stand near, not fix but witness, and sometimes that is enough to save us. Later that day, Elena carved another figure, a woman standing beside a bear, their backs turned, both looking out towards something unseen. She placed it at the trailhead beside the others. No plaque this time, no name, just the gesture. And as the snow began to fall again, thick and slow and quiet, Elena returned to her cabin, her heart full, her fire warm, and her world, though wild and vast, no longer lonely. The thaw came slowly that year, creeping in beneath the snow like a quiet secret, whispering of life before it dared to show its face. Icicles dripped steadily from the cabin eaves, and patches of earth began to peek through the crusted white, brown, and tender, and full of promise. The stream behind this cabin, once frozen into silence, murmured again as water traced its way around stubborn ice, the forest stirring with the slow rustle of waking roots and restless wings. Elena felt it in her bones first, the change, not just in the weather but in herself. Her limbs moved more freely, her steps steadier, not because the cold had gone, but because the weight she carried had shifted, softened. Henry's absence was still there, would always be there, a space no one else could fill, but it no longer hollowed her from the inside. It had become a space she could sit beside instead of falling into. Each morning she opened the window to breathe in the forest air, sharp and laced with pine, and found herself smiling for no reason. Each night she lit the fire and no longer reached instinctively for the other chair, not because she had forgotten, but because she had remembered in a different way, less ache, more reverence. Spring brought with it the slow unscrolling of green. The willows by the stream unfurled their leaves like shy dancers, and songbirds returned in a flurry of sound and color. The chickadees and jays Elena had fed all winter now swooped closer, fearless, hopping along the railing of the porch as if they belonged there as much as she did. In some ways they did. The trail cameras she had kept running through the snow began to record more movement. Foxes with their winter coats shedding, elk migrating down from the ridgelines, even the occasional shadow of a mountain lion slinking through the dusk. But of Willow and his cubs, there was no sign. Not yet. She told herself they were denning late, perhaps farther up the slope, perhaps only just now waking, and she waited without urgency. What they'd shared had not been bound by time. It would come when it came. One soft morning in April, the sun touched the clearing in a golden wash. Elena stood barefoot on the porch, the wood still cold but the air tinged with warmth. She held a bowl of blueberries and watched the trees. The food she'd left 3 days ago was gone, but she'd seen no prints. She didn't need to, she knew. Something stirred in her peripheral vision, just a flicker, and her heart skipped. She turned slowly, breath caught in her throat. There at the edge of the woods, where the shadows still clung to the bases of the pines, stood Willow, bigger than ever, his coat sleek, his muscles rippling beneath the skin like flowing water. And beside him, not 2 but 3 cubs now, one trailing close behind, smaller, perhaps born later, perhaps a little slower to grow, but unmistakably his. They stood silently, watching her. Elena set the bowl gently on the porch and stepped forward until she stood just beyond the threshold of the yard. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply met his gaze, and he held it. Around them, the forest held its breath. One of the cubs pawed at the earth, then flopped dramatically into the grass, eliciting a small, huffing grunt from its sibling. The third remained still, pressed close to Willow's side. For a long moment, it was just them, woman and bear and forest, all tethered to a thread of understanding spun between loss and presence. Elena thought of how Henry used to say the wild had its own ways of remembering, of marking time, not with clocks or calendars, but with returning paths and reappearing faces. She believed him now more than ever. She wondered if Willow remembered that moment in the snow, the way his body had tensed near the trees when Vivian stood inside the cabin, the way he'd warned her not with noise but with knowing. She would never forget it. And this visit, this quiet return with his cubs, felt like a bookend, a closing of the circle, a thank you, a goodbye. Willow turned first, his head lifting slightly, his breath fogging in the cool air. Then with the grace of something that knew it belonged to the land and not the woman who watched it, he stepped into the trees. The cubs followed, one bounding ahead, the smaller one lingering a heartbeat longer before disappearing behind its siblings. Then they were gone. Elena stood motionless for a while, her body still, her heart full. That evening she hiked the trail one last time before the ground turned fully to mud and the runoff made it treacherous. She carried with her a new carving, the most detailed she had ever made. Willow, full-grown and powerful, flanked by 3 cubs in varying postures, one bold, one curious, one clinging. The plaque beneath it read simply, "She watched, she warned, she saved." She placed it next to the others at the trailhead. Visitors would stop here sometimes, hikers, campers, wanderers. They would see the totems and wonder. Some would understand, most would not. But it didn't matter. The meaning wasn't for them, it was for her, for the forest, for Willow. And as the weeks passed, word of Vivian's arrest trickled through the small towns nearby. Caleb told her she'd be facing charges not just for tampering, but for multiple counts of fraud in other places too. He was furious, guilt-ridden for ever hiring her. Elena reassured him, gently, firmly, that it wasn't his fault, that sometimes harm wears familiar faces, that sometimes we are saved not by people, but by the unexpected. Caleb came to visit often after that. They sat on the porch, shared tea in silence, and walked the trails where she taught him the names of birds again, as she once had when he was small. The bond between them, long stretched thin by time and grief, now settled into something sturdy and steady, built on truth instead of obligation. By early May, the trees had turned fully green, and the wildflowers began to rise in bursts of yellow and blue. Elena spent her days tending the garden, walking the trails, and writing again, real writing now, not just letters to Henry, but essays, stories, recollections of wild things, and quiet miracles. She thought of sending them somewhere, maybe to a small journal, maybe to no one at all. Maybe it was enough to write them, to name what had passed between her and the bear without trying to make it more than it was. Not magic, not myth, just a moment of connection in a world that too often forgets we share it with others whose lives pulse just as fiercely as our own. One late afternoon, just before dusk, Elena stood beneath the willow tree by the stream, the one that had leaned sideways since the lightning storm 15 years ago. She traced her fingers along its gnarled bark and looked out over the land that had both broken and rebuilt her. She closed her eyes and listened, not for anything specific, but for the rhythm beneath the birdsong, beneath the breeze, beneath the churning of the stream. The rhythm that belonged to the forest, to Willow, to Henry, to her. And in that moment, she understood something with perfect clarity. Not all grief ends, but it changes. It softens. It makes room. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it invites something wild to walk beside it. A silent companion, a warning, a gift. The light shifted, the wind stilled. Elena opened her eyes and smiled. She was still here. And that somehow was more than enough. A grizzly bear saved his dog. What she did next changed his life forever. The wind had long since stopped howling, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the storm itself. Snow clung to every surface, thick, white, muffling even the smallest sound. Thomas Grady stood at the window of his small cabin, staring out into the frozen wilderness, his breath fogging up the glass. It was the same view he had seen for years. Tall, black spruce trees, pale winter sky, endless white, but it had never felt so empty. Not until Ranger vanished. The storm 2 weeks ago had come in like a freight train, fast, loud, and blinding. Thunder cracked across the sky, and the wind snapped branches like dry kindling. Thomas remembered calling for Ranger, remembered seeing the dog bolt off the porch, ears pricked, chasing something through the trees. He had waited all night, hoping to hear the jingle of his collar, the familiar thump of paws on the steps. But nothing came. Morning revealed only churned-up snow and a single trail of prints swallowed by the drifts. Thomas had followed them until they vanished into the white, calling Ranger's name until his voice gave out. Since then, every creak of the trees, every rustle of wind, had teased him with false hope. Thomas sat down by the fire, running a hand through his graying beard. The flames popped and crackled, casting flickering shadows across the worn wooden walls. On the mantel, above a row of faded photographs, hung the charred remains of his old fire helmet, melted along the rim, blackened with soot. A relic of a past life, before the blaze that ended everything, before he lost his crew, before he walked away from the world. The cabin had been his escape, a place to disappear with only Ranger for company. Now, even that comfort had been ripped away. He poured a splash of whiskey into his tin mug and leaned back, trying to drown the ache that had taken root in his chest. He told himself it was just a dog. Just a damn dog. But Ranger had been more than that. The German shepherd had stayed by his side when no one else had. When Thomas woke in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, Ranger was there. When he couldn't breathe through the guilt, Ranger pressed his warm body close, grounding him. The silence without him was unbearable. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing snow off the trees in gentle sighs. Thomas stood, grabbing another log for the fire when a sound, soft and deliberate, cut through the quiet. A heavy thump, then another. He froze, not wind, not branches, something larger, moving. He walked to the door slowly, heart beginning to thud against his ribs. It could be a moose, or worse, a bear. Grabbing his rifle from the wall, he eased open the door just a crack. Cold air rushed in, biting his skin. He looked out, then froze. Standing on the porch, its massive form barely visible in the dark, was a grizzly bear. Snow dusted its thick fur. Its breath steamed in the air like smoke, and hanging gently from its jaws was Ranger. For a moment, time stopped. Thomas couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. The bear wasn't attacking, wasn't growling or charging. It stood still, watching him with eyes that gleamed in the low light. And then, with astonishing care, it stepped forward and lowered Ranger's limp body onto the wooden planks. Thomas dropped the rifle and rushed forward, ignoring every instinct that screamed danger. He fell to his knees beside his dog, pressing his hands to Ranger's chest. There was breath, shallow but there. His fur was matted, ice crusted around his ears and paws, but he was alive. He looked up, but the bear had backed away, standing at the edge of the trees, still watching. There was no aggression in its posture, only urgency. Something in its eyes, a strange intelligence, a pleading almost. It didn't move closer, didn't retreat, just stood there, silent, waiting. Thomas scooped Ranger into his arms, wincing at the weight, and carried him inside. He laid the dog by the fire, wrapped him in blankets, and started checking for injuries. A torn paw, a bruised rib, dehydration. Nothing fatal. Whatever hell he'd been through, he had survived it. The bear was gone when Thomas checked again. Its prints led off into the forest. He stood in the doorway for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A grizzly had returned his dog to him, carried him home like a child, left him on the doorstep, and vanished. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat by Ranger's side, offering water in a bowl, speaking softly. "You dumb mutt," he whispered, voice cracking. "What the hell happened out there?" Ranger stirred, ears twitching. He let out a soft whine and tried to lift his head. Thomas placed a hand on his side. "Shh, just rest." He kept replaying it in his mind, the way the bear had looked at him, not with wild hunger or primal fear, but with purpose, as if it had known exactly what it was doing, as if it had wanted him to see something. By morning, Ranger had managed to sit up, blinking blearily. Thomas fed him broth and sat on the floor beside him, staring at the fire. Something was changing. The silence hadn't lifted, not completely, but it didn't feel so empty now. It felt suspended, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. And somewhere deep in the trees, he knew the bear was still watching, still waiting. He didn't know why. Not yet. But part of him, some quiet, long-dead ember, was beginning to stir. The sun rose pale and distant over the treetops, casting a silver sheen across the snow-covered forest. Thomas stood on the porch, cradling a mug of hot coffee between his gloved hands, eyes sweeping the trees like a man expecting something. Ranger lay curled inside by the fire, still weak but stronger than the day before, his ears twitching at every creak of the wind. Thomas had barely slept, though not from worry. Something had settled into him since the bear's visit, a strange, electric anticipation, like the moments before a storm when the sky holds its breath. He found himself scanning the edge of the woods again and again, not with fear, but with an unsettling sense of incompletion, as if whatever had begun last night wasn't over. Tracks in the snow confirmed what he already knew. The bear had stayed for a while after leaving Ranger, pacing just beyond the trees, then headed back into the forest, her trail weaving through the snow in wide arcs before disappearing into the deeper brush. Thomas had followed the prints for a few yards, stopping just where the trees began to thicken. He felt no urge to go further then, not because he was afraid, but because something told him the bear would return when it was ready. It didn't feel like a one-time encounter. It felt like the opening line of a conversation yet to be spoken. By mid-afternoon, the sun hovered low on the horizon, already preparing to vanish. Thomas stepped out again, checking the skis, the temperature, the trees, and then he saw her. The grizzly stood at the same place she had the night before, tall and broad, fur dusted with snow, eyes locked onto his with an expression that still unnerved him. He didn't know what to call it, not quite human, not quite animal, but somewhere in between. She didn't come forward this time. Instead, she turned her head slowly, then stepped to the side, her massive body moving silently through the snow. She paused, glanced back at him, and took another step. A message clear as any spoken word. Come. Thomas's hand instinctively went to the rifle at the door, but he stopped himself. He wouldn't need it. Not now, not for her. He looked back at the cabin. Ranger had raised his head, ears alert, eyes fixed on the open door. Thomas walked inside, knelt beside him, and placed a hand on the dog's head. I think she wants something, he murmured. Ranger let out a soft, low whine and struggled to rise. No, Thomas said gently. You stay. But the dog refused. With a groan, he lifted himself to his feet and limped toward the doorway, pausing beside Thomas as if to say, if you're going, I'm going too. Thomas sighed. All right then. Let's see where she takes us. They followed the bear into the woods, the snow crunching beneath their boots and paws. The forest felt different this time. Not hostile, not empty, but alive with an awareness Thomas had never noticed before. Birds were silent. No rustle of deer or fox, just the steady sound of footsteps through snow, and the silent shadow of the grizzly leading them deeper into the wild. The terrain grew rougher, fallen logs, tangled branches, snowdrifts up to Thomas's knees. He paused often to help Ranger over obstacles, the dog refusing to give up despite his limp. The bear moved ahead, always just within sight, waiting when they lagged behind, then continuing. She never hurried, never growled, just led. After more than an hour, they descended into a ravine choked with snow and ice. The trees here were thicker, older, the air sharper. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a quiet blue dusk. Then the bear stopped. She turned, looked at Thomas, and let out a low, guttural huff before padding toward a half-hidden opening between two boulders. A den. Thomas approached slowly, peering into the shadows. Inside, curled in a shallow nest of pine and moss, was a cub. Small, too small. Its eyes were half-lidded, breath shallow, ribs showing through patchy fur. Thomas knelt at the entrance, his heart tightening. The cub looked barely alive. The mother stood nearby, her body trembling slightly, not from cold, but from tension. Watching him, trusting him. Desperate, Thomas didn't hesitate. He set down his pack, pulled out a thermal blanket, and crawled into the den. The heat was stifling, the smell earthy and raw, but he didn't care. He wrapped the cub gently, lifting it with practiced care, checking its pulse, its gums, its eyes. Dehydrated, weak, starving. You poor thing, he whispered. You're hanging on by a thread. Ranger stood just outside the den, ears forward, tail still. The bear paced nearby but made no move to interfere. Thomas reached for his canteen and let a few drops of water touch the cub's lips. It licked reflexively. Good, that was something. He worked in silence, letting muscle memory guide him. Years of emergency training from a life he thought he had buried. Splints, drips, compresses. Only now the patient wasn't a person. It was a fragile, dying piece of wilderness handed to him by its mother. By the time he finished, the cub's breathing had stabilized. Not much, but better. The mother let out a soft grunt and lowered herself to the ground a few feet away, her massive head resting on her paws, her eyes fixed on the cub. Thomas backed out slowly, brushing dirt and pine needles from his knees. Ranger pressed against him, tail swaying once. We'll need to come back tomorrow, Thomas murmured. Maybe bring more supplies, food, heat, milk if I can improvise it. He looked at the bear, and for the first time she looked tired, vulnerable, mortal. You did good, he said softly. But now it's my turn. The walk back to the cabin was quiet. The cold had deepened, stars twinkling in the black above. Thomas said nothing. Ranger stayed close. The forest had swallowed them and spit them back out, not as strangers, but as something new, witnesses to an unspoken pact. When they reached the cabin, Thomas started a fire, sat down with a map, and began planning. Tomorrow they'd return with everything he could carry, and the day after that, if needed. Until the cub was strong, until the mother no longer looked at him with desperation. He was no longer just surviving out here. He had been chosen, called, and for the first time in years he felt that old fire flicker back to life. Not the kind that burned down buildings or took lives, but the kind that made a man fight to save them. The days that followed settled into a rhythm both strange and strangely natural. Each morning, Thomas packed his old backpack with supplies, blankets, soft cloth, makeshift bottles fashioned from old camping gear, protein-rich baby formula he managed to whip up from powdered milk and fish oil, a small vial of antibiotics from his emergency kit, even some ground venison softened in broth. Each time he left, Ranger stood at the door, tail wagging faintly, eager to follow. And each time Thomas hesitated. But the dog's resolve was clear. He limped beside his master through the snow, never falling behind, his eyes brightening with every step, as though the trail itself was drawing strength back into his bones. The path to the den had grown familiar. He no longer questioned the bear's presence or her intentions. She met them each morning at the tree line, emerging from the gloom like a silent sentinel, her breath curling in clouds around her face. No growls, no fear, just a shared understanding. She would lead them in, she would wait, and she would trust. Thomas had never expected to hold a bear cub in his arms, let alone feed it, warm it, whisper words of encouragement to it like a father calming a fevered child. But there he was, kneeling in the soft earth of the den, stroking its fur, watching its small eyes flutter open for longer stretches each day. The cub had begun to respond to him, weakly at first, then with growing awareness. It suckled from the bottle without resistance now. It raised its head to sniff his coat. It mewed softly when Thomas packed up to leave, its tiny voice chasing him up the slope like a fragile echo. Ranger, too, had taken to lying at the mouth of the den during these visits, his presence calm and protective. Once Thomas caught him gently licking the cub's paw while the mother watched from a short distance away, her massive body low to the ground, her eyes warm with something Thomas hadn't seen in years. Peace. Healing, he realized, wasn't always a battle. Sometimes it was this, a quiet stretch of time, a stretch of woods, and the act of simply showing up. Caring. Offering life to something smaller, more fragile, when you yourself still carried the weight of what had been lost. In the evenings back at the cabin, Thomas found himself speaking more, sometimes to Ranger, sometimes aloud to no one at all. Memories surfaced like smoke in the firelight. He would talk about the old days, about the station back in Anchorage, about his team, Russ, who never took anything seriously, Maya, who could climb a 5-story ladder like it was a staircase, Torres, who cracked jokes even in the middle of chaos. The last fire had taken them all. He had made it out by a thread, dragging one of the rookies behind him, only to watch the building collapse in on the others. The guilt had buried him, deeper than ash, deeper than the grave. But now, as he sat beside Ranger and stared into the flames, those memories didn't burn as much. They warmed. He could see their faces, hear their laughter, and not flinch. There was something about the cub's soft breaths, the mother bear's steady eyes, that made space for all of it to come back, softer, rounder, survivable. One evening, as he rubbed balm into Ranger's paw pads and refilled a bottle for the next morning, Thomas felt something shift. The cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a home again, not just for him, but for something bigger. He looked at Ranger, whose eyes were half-lidded with contentment, and murmured, "You knew, didn't you, when she came back? You knew she needed help." Ranger thumped his tail once against the wooden floor. The next day, the bear was waiting closer than usual. Her body was tense, pacing slightly at the edge of the woods. Thomas felt his stomach twist. Something was wrong. He and Ranger followed her quickly, the trail now etched into their minds like an old memory. When they reached the den, the mother didn't stop. She led them past it, through the ravine, into a hollow Thomas hadn't seen before, a hidden grove where the snow seemed untouched. In its center stood a second cub, this one larger, healthier. Siblings. The cub bounded forward when it saw its mother, then paused, noticing the strangers. Ranger barked softly, tail wagging. The mother nudged the healthier cub gently toward the weaker one's den, then stepped aside. Thomas watched, breath held, as the healthy cub crept inside, curled up beside its sibling, and began licking its ear. A soft whimper answered. Thomas exhaled. The family was coming back together. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the way the bears had reunited. The mother's decision to bring the stronger cub to the weaker one, as if to say, it's time now. Heal together. There was something unspeakably human in that gesture, something that reached straight into Thomas's chest and tightened gently around the place where grief had once wrapped itself like barbed wire. He dreamed again, but this time the fire wasn't destructive. It flickered in a hearth, warm and orange and calm. His crew sat around it, laughing, mugs in hand, boots kicked up. They looked at him, not accusingly, not mournfully, but with a kind of ease, a nod, as if to say, you made it out. Now, love. In the dream, Ranger rested beside him. The cub was there too, curled into his lap like a puppy, and somewhere beyond the light, the massive shape of the mother bear stood guard, silent and sure. When he awoke, there were tears on his face. But for once, they didn't sting. They healed. The next morning, as he prepared for another trip into the woods, Thomas paused at the doorway and looked around the cabin. The boots by the door, the stove warm, the smell of pine smoke. Ranger watching him with calm eyes, and the pack filled with medicine, food, and hope. Something had changed. The forest, once a place to disappear, had become a place to return from. Not to escape life, but to rebuild it. He stepped out into the snow, Ranger at his side, the trail ahead carved into the land and into his heart. Somewhere deep in the trees, the bear was waiting. And for the first time in years, Thomas knew what it felt like to be needed. Not by duty, not by tragedy, but by life itself, quiet, wild, and full of grace. The days had grown longer, though the chill still clung to the forest like breath on glass. Snow was beginning to soften around the edges, melting in slow drips from the pine branches, forming tiny rivulets that traced their way through the ravine. Thomas walked the familiar path with a rhythm that no longer felt foreign. Each step into the woods was purposeful, guided not by obligation or curiosity, but by connection. Ranger trotted beside him, no longer limping, his strength restored, his head held high. The cub, no longer frail and trembling, met them now with playful growls and clumsy pounces. It had grown quickly, fed by Thomas's concoctions and warmed by his constant attention. Its coat had thickened, its eyes grown brighter. Each day it moved with more confidence, wrestling with its sibling, exploring the den's perimeter, then racing back to its mother with a happy snort. The mother bear watched these games with calm satisfaction, her immense body still and solid as a boulder, but her eyes always alert, always grateful. Sometimes Thomas would catch her gaze as she rested beside the den. It wasn't a look of wild suspicion anymore. It was something gentler. Recognition, familiarity, and maybe something like understanding. He no longer spoke to her with words. The silence between them had its own kind of speech now, pauses and glances, gestures and stillness. The language of trust, slowly learned and deeply earned. On this morning, though, Thomas sensed something different. The air was clearer. The birds, long silent during the height of winter, had begun to return. A woodpecker tapped somewhere in the distance. A red squirrel darted across the path ahead, chittering. The forest was stirring, and so was something else. When they reached the den, the bear did not rise as she usually did. She simply stood there already, waiting at the mouth of the cave, the cubs behind her. Thomas approached, pack in hand, but she didn't step aside to allow him in. Instead, she took one slow, deliberate step forward, then another. Ranger bristled slightly, but Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. Easy, he whispered. The bear stopped just a few feet away. She looked at him, long, deep, unblinking. Then she lowered her head, gave a short huff, and turned. She began to walk away. Not into the trees, but down the slope, away from the den. The cubs followed her, one bounding ahead, the other trotting close to her side. Thomas stood there for a moment, unsure what he was witnessing. Then it hit him. She was leaving, taking them back into the forest, returning to whatever wildlife they had paused when they came to him. The mother bear stopped at the edge of the grove and looked back. It was not a plea, not an invitation, just a moment of stillness, an acknowledgement. Then she turned again and vanished into the trees. No fanfare, no roar, just silence, and the faint crackling sound of branches parting to let them through. Thomas stood still for a long time. Ranger didn't move either. The air around them felt strangely empty now, like a story had just ended. And yet, there was no sorrow, just a deep, echoing sense of something fulfilled. They had come to him broken, in need. He had done what he could. And now they were gone, not lost, not taken, but restored to the wild where they belonged. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, Ranger curled at his feet. He stared into the flames, thinking not of what had left, but of what had changed. The cabin no longer felt like a cave carved out to survive the weight of memory. It felt like a shelter built for life to move through, sometimes briefly, sometimes with great noise, and sometimes in silence. The photos above the mantel didn't burn in his chest when he looked at them anymore. They shimmered with warmth. His crew would never return, but he had stopped asking them to. They were part of him still, not as ghosts to be mourned, but as roots that grounded him in purpose. A few days passed. The forest seemed to breathe again, relaxed and open. Thomas went about his routines, mending gear, restocking supplies, chopping wood, but each task felt less like maintenance and more like preparation. He didn't know for what. He only knew that something inside him had shifted. Then, one morning, before the frost had melted, he heard movement outside. Not the heavy tread of a bear, not the rush of an animal in flight, but the soft, rhythmic crunch of cautious steps. He opened the door, expecting a deer maybe, or just the wind. But there at the edge of the clearing was the mother bear, alone. No cubs this time, just her. She stood for a long moment watching him. Then, with deliberate steps, she approached. Not all the way, just far enough to be seen, to be felt. Her eyes locked on his. In them was something final. Not goodbye, but gratitude. A closing of a circle. She huffed once, deeply, and then turned, disappearing for the last time into the trees. Thomas didn't follow. He didn't need to. That night, as snow began to fall again in soft flakes, he lit a fire outside the cabin. Ranger sat beside him, fur dusted with white. Thomas lifted a mug of steaming broth toward the trees and whispered, "Thank you." Not just to the bear, but to the forest, to whatever force had sent her to his doorstep that night, to the world that, in all its strangeness and sorrow, still found ways to give. In the months that followed, spring crept into the land, snow melted into streams, buds formed on branches. Ranger chased squirrels again, his strength fully returned. Thomas planted vegetables in the small garden plot behind the cabin for the first time in years. Life had come back, slowly, gently, but it had returned. Sometimes he would walk down to the ravine and sit where the den used to be. The earth was empty now, overgrown with moss and needles, but he felt no loss, only peace. He knew they were out there somewhere, wild and alive. And that was enough. He had come to the wilderness to lose himself. But it was in giving that he had found what he hadn't known he'd needed, a reason to care again, to reach, to heal. The forest had taken so much from him once, but now it had given something back, something quiet, enduring, and true.